What would you do if the person you trusted most was hiding a life-altering secret? My wife's betrayal wasn't just an affair. It was a calculated plan to tear my world apart. Emails I wasn't supposed to find, whispers behind closed doors, a custody fight that shattered everything I thought I knew. But there's more. Twists, lies, and a shocking confrontation that changed everything. Are you ready to uncover the truth with me? Stay tuned. You won't believe where this story goes. The sound of Lila's laughter drifted through the living room, momentarily breaking the heavy silence that often filled the Hartwell household these days. Jason sat at the kitchen table, flipping through a stack of bills with a furrowed brow. His hand hovered over a medical invoice, the numbers blurring as frustration built in his chest. Across the room, Sophia leaned against the counter, absently stirring her coffee, her gaze distant. "Hey, Dad, remember this?" Lila's voice rang out, cheerful and hopeful. She held up a framed family photo from years ago, a younger Jason with his arm around Sophia, and little Lila perched on his shoulders, her grin as bright as the summer sun behind them. Jason's heart twisted. He stared at the photo, trying to summon the memory. It was there, faint, just out of reach, like a whisper he couldn't quite hear. His lips twitched into a weak smile. I think so," he murmured, his voice uncertain. Lila's face fell, and she carefully placed the photo back on the mantel. She walked toward him, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her shirt. "It's okay, Dad. You'll remember one day." Her words were soft, kind, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of disappointment. Jason forced a chuckle, ruffling her hair. "Of course, sweetheart. Just give me time." He didn't believe his own words, and neither did she. Sophia's spoon clattered against the counter. "You should rest, Jason. Stressing over those papers won't change anything." Her tone was clipped, almost cold. "I'll rest when I figure out how to pay for everything," Jason replied, his voice tightening. "And when I stop feeling like a stranger in my own life." Sophia sighed, turning away. "You're not the only one carrying this weight, you know." The words hung in the air like a heavy cloud, neither of them willing to break the silence. Lila glanced between them, her small shoulders tensing. "I'm gonna finish my homework," she mumbled before retreating to her room, the air crackling with unspoken tension. Jason slumped back in his chair, his hand running through his hair. "It didn't used to be like this, Sophia. We used to talk, laugh. What happened to us?" Sophia hesitated, her fingers tightening around her coffee mug. "Life happened, Jason, and it's not as simple as just fixing it." Her words stung more than he cared to admit. He stared at her, searching for a glimpse of the woman he had fallen in love with, but all he saw was a stranger wrapped in distance and weariness. He wanted to reach out, to pull her back from wherever she had drifted, but his hands stayed on the table, motionless. That night, Jason sat alone in the living room, flipping through an old photo album. Images of their wedding, Lila's first steps, and sunlit vacations filled the pages. Each picture was like a knife, cutting deeper into the void in his mind. He didn't hear Sophia come in until she spoke. "Jason, why are you doing this to yourself?" He glanced up, startled, and closed the album. I want to feel connected to something again, to us, to who I was." Sophia crossed her arms, her expression unreadable. "You can't live in the past. It won't fix anything now." Jason's frustration boiled over. "What am I supposed to do, Sophia? Just accept that I don't even know my own life anymore? That I can't remember the best moments of my own daughter's childhood?" Her eyes softened for a moment, but the walls she had built around herself quickly returned. "Maybe it's not about remembering, Jason. Maybe it's about moving forward." Her words lingered as she left the room, leaving Jason alone with his thoughts. He opened the album again, his fingers tracing the edges of a photo where Sophia's smile once radiated warmth. He couldn't help but wonder if she had already moved forward. Without him, Jason stood in the kitchen, staring at the unfamiliar key resting in the palm of his hand. The smooth brass glinted under the fluorescent light. He turned it over, searching for clues, a label, an inscription, anything, but there was nothing. Just an ordinary key. Yet it didn't belong to their house or any lock he could recall. He glanced toward the living room where Sophia sat on the couch, scrolling through her phone. Her face was illuminated by the soft glow of the screen, her expression unreadable. Jason took a deep breath, the weight of suspicion pressing heavily on his chest. "Sophia!" he called, trying to keep his voice steady. She didn't look up. "Sophia, what's this key for?" Her head snapped up, and for a brief moment a flicker of something, surprise, guilt, crossed her face. She quickly masked it with a dismissive shrug. "What key?" Jason held it up. "This, I found it in your car." She hesitated, just long enough for the tension to thicken. "Oh, that? It's probably from work. You know how I sometimes need to lock up." Jason frowned. "Your cafe doesn't have keys like this. I've seen the locks. This looks more like a house key." Sophia rolled her eyes, feigning annoyance. "Why are you always digging through my things, Jason? I don't have the energy for this." "I wasn't digging!" Jason's voice rose, frustration bleeding through. "I was trying to find the grocery list and this fell out of your bag. You're avoiding the question, where is this key from?" "Work," she snapped, standing abruptly. "I don't know why you're making a big deal out of nothing. Can't I have one thing in my life that you don't question?" Jason's jaw clenched as he struggled to contain his anger. "One thing. Sophia, I barely even know what's going on in your life anymore. You're always gone. And now this?" He gestured to the key. "I just want an honest answer." Sophia's gaze softened momentarily, but then her walls went back up. "Jason, I'm tired. I can't keep having these pointless arguments with you. You're imagining things." Before he could respond, she grabbed her purse and stormed out the front door, leaving Jason standing alone in the kitchen, the key still clutched tightly in his hand. The sound of the door slamming echoed in his ears. He leaned against the counter, closing his eyes. Doubt and anger churned inside him, but underneath it all was a deeper ache, the growing realization that Sophia was slipping further away from him. Later that evening, Jason sat at the dining table, flipping through Sophia's phone. He hesitated before unlocking it, guilt gnawing at the edges of his resolve, but the unanswered questions loomed too large. He navigated to her call log and froze. Mark. The name appeared several times, both incoming and outgoing. Jason stared at the screen, his heart pounding. Mark. He racked his brain, trying to connect the name to someone he might know. A friend? A coworker? No. He'd never heard Sophia mention anyone named Mark. As he scrolled further, his breath hitched. There were late-night calls, several of them. Calls she'd made from home while he was asleep. The door creaked open and Jason quickly locked the phone, slipping it back into its usual spot on the counter. Lila walked in, rubbing her eyes, her favorite stuffed bear tucked under her arm. "Can't sleep?" Jason asked, forcing a smile. She nodded, climbing onto the chair beside him. "I heard you and Mom fighting again." Jason's chest tightened. "We weren't fighting, sweetheart, just talking." Lila tilted her head, studying him with a wisdom far beyond her years. "Is she mad at you because of the accident?" Jason blinked, caught off guard. "What makes you think that?" "Sometimes," Lila said softly, "I hear her on the phone. She says things like, 'I don't know if I can do this anymore.'" Her voice wavered, and her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "She's not going to leave us, right, Dad?" Jason felt a sharp pang of guilt and sadness. He pulled Lila into his arms, holding her tightly. "No, sweetheart, she won't leave. I promise." But even as he said the words, they felt hollow, empty. He wasn't sure he believed them himself. That night, long after Lila had gone back to bed, Jason sat on the couch, the key and Sophia's call log replaying over and over in his mind. The pieces of a puzzle he couldn't yet solve, but one thing was becoming clear. Sophia was hiding something, and it was only a matter of time before he found out what. Jason sat on the porch steps, the morning air crisp against his skin. He held his journal tightly, its pages still mostly blank. The weight of it felt heavier than the few ounces it was. It wasn't just paper. It was an anchor, a lifeline to a mind that felt like it was slipping through his fingers. Behind him, the screen door creaked open. Mrs. Ellen, their elderly neighbor, shuffled out with a mug of coffee. She had a kindness about her, a soft warmth in her tired eyes. "Morning, Jason," she greeted, her voice steady, comforting. "Morning," Jason replied, forcing a smile. She settled into her usual spot on her porch, her gaze drifting across the yard. After a long pause, she spoke again. "I've been meaning to ask, how you doing? Really?" Jason hesitated. Mrs. Ellen had lived next door since he and Sophia moved in. She'd seen the laughter, the barbecues, the late nights when the lights were on because Lila couldn't sleep. She'd also seen the silence creeping in lately, the way Jason and Sophia avoided each other like strangers. "Honestly, I don't know," he admitted, his voice cracking slightly. "It's like I'm here, but not all of me, and the pieces I do have, half the time they don't fit." Mrs. Ellen nodded, sipping her coffee. "I saw you the other day, sitting by the garage staring at that old toolbox. You know, I remember when you bought it, right after Lila was born. You were so excited, said you were going to build her a swing set." Jason's heart clenched. The image flickered in his mind, blurry and incomplete. He could almost feel the rough edges of the wood under his hands, hear Lila's giggles as he worked. But the memory wouldn't solidify. It remained just out of reach, taunting him. "Funny thing," Mrs. Ellen continued, her tone soft. "I saw Sophia that day too, but she wasn't here. She was with a man." Jason froze. The words hit him like a physical blow, stealing the breath from his lungs. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Ellen hesitated, glancing down at her cup. "I wasn't going to say anything. Figured it wasn't my place. But it didn't look right, Jason. They were arguing, in the parking lot at Murphy's grocery. She looked upset and She stopped herself, shaking her head. "Maybe I'm just an old woman with too much time on my hands." "No," Jason said quickly, his voice sharper than he intended. "No, I need to know." Mrs. Ellen studied him for a long moment before nodding. Tall fellow, dark hair, expensive-looking suit. He was waving his hands around like he was trying to make a point. Sophia kept shaking her head. Then she got in her car and drove off. Jason stared at the ground, his mind racing. The description matched Mark, the man he'd seen in Sophia's call log, the name that had haunted his thoughts since the night before. But why would she argue with him? What could they possibly have to fight about? "Thanks, Mrs. Ellen," he murmured, his voice hollow. "Jason," she said gently, her expression full of concern. "Whatever's going on, you've got Lila. Don't forget that. She's watching you. She needs you to be strong." Her words pierced through the fog in his mind, leaving an ache he couldn't ignore. He nodded, forcing another smile. "I won't forget." Later that day, Jason found himself back in the garage, staring at the toolbox. He opened it, running his fingers over the tools, their metal surfaces cold and familiar. A memory stirred, himself, younger, sanding a plank of wood, Sophia standing in the doorway holding Lila, both of them smiling at him. But then, it shifted. Sophia's smile faded. Her voice became sharp, accusing. "You always spend more time with your projects than with us, Jason. Do you even care?" The memory blurred, fractured, leaving Jason reeling. He closed the toolbox with a loud clatter, gripping the edge of the workbench to steady himself. "Dad?" Lila's voice cut through the silence, soft and hesitant. Jason turned to find her standing in the doorway, her big eyes filled with worry. "Hey, sweetheart," he said, his voice trembling. "What's up?" I wanted to make sure you're okay." Jason knelt down, pulling her into a tight hug. "I'm okay," he whispered, though the words felt like a lie. "As long as I've got you, I'll always be okay." Lila held him tightly, her small arms wrapping around his neck. "I love you, Dad." "I love you too," Jason murmured, tears stinging his eyes as he clung to the one thing that still felt real. Jason sat by the cafe window, absently stirring his coffee as he watched the cars pass by on the street. The light chatter of patrons around him barely registered. His mind was preoccupied, circling the same thoughts. Sophia, the mysterious Mark, and the fragments of memory that refused to piece together. His gaze flickered to the counter where Sophia worked with her usual practiced ease. She hadn't noticed him yet, but Jason wasn't here to chat. He was here to observe, to see if he could make sense of the growing list of inconsistencies that haunted him. The cafe door jingled as a man walked in. Jason froze. Tall, dark-haired, dressed in a tailored suit, just as Mrs. Ellen had described. The man exuded confidence, his stride deliberate, his expression calm but calculating. He scanned the room briefly before locking eyes with Sophia. A flicker of recognition passed between them, subtle but unmistakable. Jason's grip on his coffee mug tightened. He leaned forward, straining to hear as the man approached the counter. Sophia glanced around nervously before stepping closer to him, lowering her voice. Jason couldn't make out the words, but their body language spoke volumes. Sophia was tense, defensive, while the man appeared composed, almost smug. Moments later, the man slid a folder across the counter. Sophia hesitated before grabbing it, her fingers trembling slightly. Jason's chest tightened as he watched her shove the folder under the register, glancing toward him as if sensing his presence. Their eyes met briefly, and Jason felt a pang of guilt for spying, but it was quickly overshadowed by suspicion. The man turned and headed toward the exit, but not before his gaze landed on Jason. Their eyes locked, and Jason saw a flicker of recognition. Mark knew who he was. Jason's hands shook as he reached for his cane, his heart pounding. He rose unsteadily, following the man out the door. "Hey!" Jason called, his voice firm despite the lump in his throat. Mark stopped, turning slowly with a bemused expression. "Can I help you?" His tone was smooth, unbothered. Jason stepped closer, his grip on the cane tightening. "You're Mark, aren't you?" Mark's smirk widened. "And you must be Jason. I've heard about you." Jason's jaw clenched. "From Sophia, I'm guessing." Mark chuckled, crossing his arms. "Among others. She's mentioned you in passing." The casual tone was like gasoline on Jason's already simmering anger. "Stay away from my wife," Jason growled. "Whatever you're doing, whatever this is, it ends now." Mark raised an eyebrow, feigning surprise. "I think you're mistaken about what this is, but I'll humor you. What exactly do you think is happening here?" Jason took a shaky breath, his mind racing. He wanted to accuse Mark outright, to demand answers, but he knew he didn't have enough evidence. "I don't know yet," Jason admitted, his voice low but steady. "But I'll find out." Mark smiled, infuriatingly calm. "Good luck with that. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have places to be." He brushed past Jason, the faint scent of expensive cologne lingering in the air. Jason watched him go, a storm of emotions brewing inside him, anger, frustration, fear. He knew he couldn't let this go, not when so much was at stake. Later that night, Jason confronted Sophia as she came home. The folder was tucked under her arm, her expression wary as she walked through the door. Jason was waiting in the living room, his arms crossed. "Who is he?" Jason demanded. Sophia froze, her eyes darting to the folder before meeting his gaze. "Who?" "Don't play dumb, Sophia. Mark. Who is he and why were you talking to him?" Sophia sighed, setting the folder down on the coffee table. "He's a client," she said, her voice tired. "He needed some help with a financial matter, and I offered advice. That's all." Jason's eyes narrowed. "A client? And that's why you're meeting him in secret, taking his calls late at night?" Sophia's face flushed with irritation. "You're being paranoid, Jason. I'm trying to help you, to keep this family afloat, and all you can do is accuse me?" Jason shook his head, his voice trembling. "If there's nothing going on, then tell me the truth. Show me what's in that folder." Sophia hesitated, her hand hovering over the folder. For a moment, Jason thought she might relent, but then she pulled it back toward her, clutching it protectively. "I can't," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Not yet." Jason stared at her, his heart sinking. The woman standing before him was a stranger wrapped in secrets. "I don't know who you are anymore," he said, his voice breaking. Sophia looked away, tears glistening in her eyes. "Neither do I," she murmured before retreating to the bedroom, leaving Jason alone with the unanswered questions that threatened to consume him. Jason sat in the car parked across the street from the apartment building, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The name on the building's entry sign, Ridgeview Heights, glared at him like a cruel reminder of the secrets he was unraveling. He had seen Sophia enter just moments ago, her face drawn tight with something between determination and fear. What was she doing here? And more importantly, who was she meeting? Jason's breathing quickened as he watched her disappear through the revolving doors. Every instinct told him to follow, to confront her right then and there, but he forced himself to stay put. He needed proof. Rushing in would only give her a chance to spin more lies, and he was done playing her games. A text buzzed on his phone, jolting him out of his thoughts. It was from Lila. "Love you, Dad. Can't wait for movie night." The simple message made his chest ache. He clenched his jaw, determined not to let Lila see the cracks forming in their family. An hour passed before Sophia finally re-emerged. She looked tired, her steps slow, as though carrying the weight of whatever had just transpired inside. Jason sank lower in his seat, watching her carefully. Her hand reached into her bag, pulling out her phone. She made a quick call, her voice muffled but her tone sharp. A moment later, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. The door opened and Jason's stomach dropped. Mark. Sophia slid into the car without hesitation. Jason's grip on the steering wheel tightened again, and his heart pounded so loudly it drowned out every rational thought. Without thinking, he started the engine and began following them, keeping his distance as they weaved through the busy streets. They eventually pulled into a quiet restaurant, tucked away from the main road. Jason parked a block away, his hands trembling. He felt like an outsider looking in, watching his marriage unravel from the safety of the shadows. Inside the dimly lit restaurant, Jason found a table with a clear view of theirs. He tried to blend in, keeping his head down as he watched Sophia and Mark lean in close, their conversation animated. Mark handed her a document and she nodded, her face hardening. Jason's chest tightened as he tried to decipher their interaction. Was it business? Was it personal? Or was it both? After what felt like an eternity, Jason couldn't take it anymore. He stood, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Heads turned, but he didn't care. He marched to their table, his heart hammering in his chest. "Sophia," he said, his voice strained but steady. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock. "Jason, what are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same thing," he shot back, glaring at Mark. "But I think I already know." Mark leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing on his lips. "Jason, right? Nice to finally meet you." "Don't," Jason said, his voice low and dangerous. He turned back to Sophia. How long have you been meeting him behind my back?" Sophia's face flushed. "It's not what you think." "Then tell me what it is." Jason's voice rose, drawing more stares from nearby tables. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're lying to my face, again." Sophia's hands trembled as she clutched the document Mark had given her. "It's complicated, Jason. Complicated?" Jason laughed bitterly, his voice breaking. "Try me. Explain how lying to me, sneaking around, and meeting him is complicated." Mark stood, his calm demeanor now laced with irritation. "Maybe you should take this conversation somewhere private, Jason. You're making a scene." Jason's fists clenched at his sides. "Stay out of this." Mark took a step closer, his smirk returning. "Or what? You'll hit me with that cane?" The insult struck a nerve and Jason took a shaky step forward. But before he could respond, Sophia stood between them, her hands up in a plea for peace. "Stop it, both of you," she said, her voice cracking. She turned to Jason, her eyes filled with tears. "I didn't want it to be like this." Jason's anger faltered, replaced by a deep, aching sadness. "Then why, Sophia? Why are you doing this to us?" She looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "I can't explain it right now, but you have to trust me." "Trust you?" Jason's voice broke completely. "How can I trust you when you've done nothing but lie?" Sophia opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Mark placed a hand on her shoulder, and Jason's stomach turned. "I'm done," Jason said finally, his voice hollow. "I'll find out the truth, with or without you." He turned and walked away, his vision blurred with tears he refused to shed. The weight of their fractured marriage pressed down on him with every step, and he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Jason's hands trembled as he spread out the papers across the dining table. Each document, each scribbled note was another piece of the tangled web he was slowly unraveling. Bank statements with unexplained transactions. Emails Sophia thought she had deleted. Even a receipt from a luxury hotel Jason had never set foot in. The folder Mark had given Sophia sat in the center of it all, mocking him with its unopened seal. Jason had waited until the house was empty. Sophia gone to work, Lila at school, before daring to touch it. Now, as he stared at the bold printed words on the cover, his chest tightened. Confidential. It took every ounce of strength to steady his hands as he pried it open. Inside was a single contract, legal jargon spilling down the page like an accusation. At the top, Sophia's signature stood out like a dagger to his heart, and beneath it, Mark's. Jason sank into the chair, the weight of betrayal pressing him down. He barely noticed when the front door creaked open until Lila's voice called out, "Dad?" Hurriedly, he stuffed the folder back into his bag. "In here, sweetheart," he replied, forcing his voice to sound normal. Lila poked her head into the dining room, her eyes bright with curiosity. "What are you doing?" "Just some work," Jason said quickly. "How was school?" Lila frowned, sensing the tension. She crossed the room and leaned against the table, her small fingers brushing one of the papers Jason hadn't hidden in time. "What's this?" Jason hesitated. "Just boring grown-up stuff," he said with a weak smile. She didn't look convinced, but she let it go. "Can we have pizza for dinner?" Jason chuckled softly, grateful for the distraction. "Sure, why not?" Her grin was the brightest thing he'd seen all day. "You're the best, Dad." She skipped out of the room, leaving Jason alone with the suffocating weight of the truth. Hours later, Jason sat in his car outside Mark's office building. The crisp night air did little to calm the storm brewing inside him. His knuckles ached from gripping the steering wheel, but he couldn't bring himself to move. This wasn't like him. He wasn't a confrontational man. But the lies, the secrecy, it was too much. He had to face Mark. He had to hear the truth from the man himself. Jason stepped out of the car, his cane tapping against the pavement as he made his way to the entrance. The building was sleek, modern, its glass facade reflecting the city lights. Jason pushed through the revolving doors and approached the reception desk, his heart pounding. "I'm here to see Mark," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos in his chest. The receptionist raised an eyebrow. "Do you have an appointment?" Jason's jaw tightened. "No, but he'll want to see me." She hesitated before picking up the phone. After a brief conversation, she nodded. "He'll see you. 5th floor, last office on the left." Jason's grip on his cane tightened as he rode the elevator up. Each ding of the passing floors felt like a countdown to something he couldn't yet define. When the doors finally opened, he stepped into the hallway, his steps deliberate, his breaths shallow. Mark was waiting for him, leaning casually against his desk, his expression unreadable. "Jason," he said smoothly, "what an unexpected surprise." "Cut the act," Jason snapped. "I know what you're doing. I've seen the papers." Mark's eyebrows lifted in mock surprise. "Oh? And what exactly do you think you've seen?" Jason threw the folder onto the desk. "This, Sophia's signature. Your signature. What is this, some kind of deal? What are you pulling her into?" Mark picked up the folder, flipping through it leisurely. "This is business," he said finally, his tone calm. "Your wife happens to be very good at it. Maybe better than you realize." Jason's anger boiled over. "You're lying. Whatever this is, it's not just business. I can see it in her eyes every time she comes home. You're destroying her, and you're destroying us." Mark's smirk faltered, replaced by something colder. "Maybe you should ask yourself why she came to me in the first place, Jason. Maybe she needed something you couldn't give her." The words hit like a punch to the gut. Jason took a step back, his chest heaving. "You don't know anything about us." Mark leaned forward, his voice dropping. "I know more than you think, and if you're smart, you'll stay out of this." Jason's fists clenched at his sides. "This isn't over," he said through gritted teeth. Mark's smile returned, but it didn't reach his eyes. "It never is." Jason turned and left, his mind racing. As he stepped into the elevator, the weight of everything threatened to crush him, but one thought burned brighter than the rest. He wasn't going to let Mark win. Whatever it took, Jason would uncover the truth. Jason paced the length of his living room, his thoughts a whirlwind of questions and accusations. The confrontation with Mark had only added fuel to the fire, leaving him with more doubts than answers. His gaze fell on the stack of papers on the table. documents, receipts, and notes he had pieced together in his desperate attempt to understand the lies surrounding him. A knock at the door interrupted his spiraling thoughts. He froze, the sound sharp and unexpected in the stillness of the evening. He wasn't expecting anyone. Slowly he approached the door, his cane tapping softly against the wooden floor. When he opened it, he was met with a familiar face, Detective Harris. His presence was a stark reminder of a past Jason had worked hard to bury. "Detective," Jason said cautiously, "what brings you here?" Harris adjusted his hat, his expression grim. "Evening, Jason. I've been meaning to talk to you. About the accident." Jason's stomach dropped. "The accident? That was years ago." "I know," Harris replied, stepping inside. "But new information has come to light, and I thought you'd want to hear it from me before it catches you off guard." Jason led him to the living room, his mind racing. "What kind of information?" Harris pulled out a small envelope from his jacket and handed it to Jason. "Take a look." Jason hesitated before opening it. Inside was a photo, grainy but unmistakable. It showed his car, the night of the crash, parked outside a building he didn't recognize. The timestamp in the corner sent a chill down his spine. It was taken mere minutes before the accident. "This can't be right," Jason muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't remember being there." "That's what's strange," Harris said. "Witnesses say they saw someone matching your description arguing with a woman in the parking lot. Then, minutes later, your car was involved in the crash, but here's the kicker. Your medical records show you were unconscious before the impact." Jason's grip on the photo tightened. "Unconscious? How's that possible?" Harris sighed. "That's what we're trying to figure out. The woman, she's gone, disappeared shortly after the accident. And now there's a link between her and Mark." Jason's breath caught. "Mark? What does he have to do with this?" "Everything, it seems," Harris said. "We've traced financial transactions between her and him around the time of the crash. Whatever happened that night, Mark was involved." Jason's mind reeled. Pieces of the puzzle began to shift, forming a picture he didn't want to believe. The accident that had taken so much from him, his mobility, his peace of mind, wasn't an accident at all. It was orchestrated. Harris placed a hand on Jason's shoulder. "I know this is a lot to take in, but I thought you should know. If there's anything else you remember, anything that might help." Jason nodded slowly, though his thoughts were far from clear. "Thank you, Detective. I'll let you know." Harris left, his footsteps fading into the night. Jason stood alone in the living room, the photo still in his hand. Memories of that night surfaced, fragmented and blurred. He remembered the rain, the screech of tires, and the crushing weight of metal. But the parking lot, the argument, they remained a void. Sophia's voice pulled him from his thoughts. "Jason? Who was at the door?" He turned to see her standing in the doorway, her face pale. Her gaze fell on the photo, and her breath hitched. "What's that?" Jason stepped closer, holding it out to her. "You tell me, what were you doing the night of the accident?" Sophia's eyes widened in shock. "Jason, Don't lie to me," he said, his voice breaking. "Did you know about this? About Mark? About any of it?" Tears welled in her eyes as she shook her head. I didn't know he was connected to that night. I swear." Jason's heart ached at the sight of her tears, but he couldn't ignore the growing pit of betrayal. "Then why have you been meeting him? Why the secrecy? Tell me the truth, Sophia, please." She covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking. "I was scared," she whispered. "He's been holding something over me, something I did, something I regret." Jason's chest tightened. "What did you do?" Sophia looked up at him, her face streaked with tears. "I can't tell you. Not yet." Jason stared at her, his emotions a storm of anger, hurt, and despair. "Then I'll find out on my own." He turned and left the room, his resolve hardening. Whatever secrets Sophia and Mark were hiding, Jason knew one thing. He wouldn't rest until he uncovered the truth. Jason sat in his car across from Mark's office, his jaw clenched and his breath heavy. The photograph, the financial records, and Sophia's cryptic confession swirled in his mind, tightening a noose of despair around his thoughts. He couldn't shake the image of her tearful face, nor could he ignore the mounting evidence that her betrayal went far deeper than he had feared. But tonight, He wouldn't be a passive observer. He had spent hours piecing together every clue, and now he was ready to confront the truth, no matter how devastating it might be. The clock on the dashboard read 10:17 p.m. when Mark finally emerged from the building. Jason watched as he walked confidently to his car, his figure illuminated by the faint glow of the streetlights. Jason stepped out of his vehicle, gripping his cane tightly as he approached. "Mark!" Jason's voice rang out, sharp and cutting through the quiet night. Mark turned, his expression shifting from surprise to calculated calm. "Jason, to what do I owe the pleasure?" Jason stopped a few feet away, his grip on the cane tightening. "No more games. You're going to tell me everything, right here, right now." Mark smirked, leaning casually against his car. "I don't know what you're talking about." Jason's voice cracked with raw emotion. "Stop lying. I know about the accident. I know about the money. I know about Sophia." Mark's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second before returning. "You've been busy," he said, his tone mocking, "but you don't have the full story, do you?" Jason stepped closer, his eyes blazing. "Then tell me, why did you drag my wife into this? What did you want from her?" Mark chuckled darkly. "You think I dragged her into this? Jason, she came to me. She needed my help, and I was more than willing to give it." Jason's chest heaved as the words sank in. "Help with what?" Mark tilted his head, feigning pity. "You're better off not knowing, but if you insist, let's just say your perfect wife isn't as innocent as you think." Jason's vision blurred with rage. "What does that mean? What are you saying?" Mark straightened, his expression turning cold. "I'm saying that Sophia has secrets, big ones, and you might want to think twice before digging too deep." Jason's hand trembled as he raised his cane, pointing it at Mark. "If you don't tell me the truth, I swear—" "Jason?" A soft, familiar voice interrupted him. Jason turned to see Sophia standing a few feet away, her face pale and stricken. Her eyes darted between him and Mark, panic etched into every line of her expression. "What are you doing here?" Jason demanded, his voice cracking with a mixture of anger and hurt. "How long have you been standing there?" Sophia stepped closer, her hands trembling. "Jason, please, let's go home. We can talk there." Jason shook his head, tears pooling in his eyes. "No, we're talking here, with him." He gestured to Mark, who watched the scene unfold with thinly veiled amusement. Sophia's voice broke. "Jason, it's not what you think." "Then what is it?" Jason shouted. "Tell me, Sophia, because from where I'm standing it looks like you've been lying to me for months, maybe years." Sophia's shoulders sagged and she looked down, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't want to hurt you." Jason's laugh was bitter and hollow. Too late for that. Mark's smirk grew wider as he leaned against his car. "This is touching, really, but maybe you two should take this somewhere else." Jason rounded on him, his voice shaking with fury. "You don't get to speak, not after what you've done." Sophia stepped between them, her voice pleading. "Jason, please stop. This isn't helping." Jason's gaze locked onto hers, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Did you love him?" Sophia's breath caught in her throat. "Jason, answer me!" Jason roared, his voice echoing into the empty street. Sophia's lips trembled as she whispered, "I thought I did. But I was wrong." Jason staggered back, her words hitting him like a physical blow. He stared at her, the woman he had loved, trusted, built a life with, and felt his heart shatter. Mark pushed off his car, his smirk replaced with indifference. "Well, I think my work here is done." Jason turned to him, his voice cold and steady. "This isn't over." Mark raised an eyebrow. "We'll see about that." Jason watched as Mark got into his car and drove away, leaving him and Sophia standing in the oppressive silence of the night. He turned back to her, his voice trembling. "Why, Sophia? Why him?" Sophia sobbed, her hands covering her face. "I don't know, Jason. I was lost. I made a mistake." Jason's voice cracked with pain. "A mistake? You destroyed us." Sophia reached for him, but he stepped back. "Don't. I can't do this." Without another word, Jason turned and walked away, leaving Sophia alone in the cold, her cries echoing into the darkness. Jason sat alone in his darkened living room, the silence pressing against him like an invisible weight. The events of the night played over and over in his mind. Sophia's tears, her confession, and Mark's smug smirk as he drove away. Each memory felt like a wound that refused to close. On the table in front of him lay a collection of documents and photographs, the remnants of his investigation. Among them was a USB drive Detective Harris had given him earlier that day. It contained records tied to Mark, files that painted a damning picture. Jason stared at it for what felt like an eternity before finally plugging it into his laptop. The screen came alive with folders labeled in cold, impersonal terms: financials, correspondence, legal. His fingers hovered over the trackpad, a sense of dread tightening in his chest. He clicked on financials first. What he found made his stomach turn. Large sums of money had been transferred between Mark's accounts and entities linked to shady shell companies. But one transaction stood out, a payment made to a woman named Clarissa Hines. The name sent a chill down Jason's spine. It was familiar, though he couldn't immediately place it. His heart pounded as he clicked on correspondence. Among dozens of emails was one that caught his eye, titled Final Arrangements. It was from Mark to Clarissa, dated just days before Jason's accident. The email was cold and calculated, detailing instructions for what appeared to be a staged confrontation. Jason's breath hitched as he read the final line. "Ensure he's incapacitated. We'll handle the rest." The words blurred as tears filled Jason's eyes. His accident hadn't been an accident at all. It had been orchestrated by Mark. The realization hit him like a freight train, stealing the breath from his lungs. His hands trembled as he scrolled through more emails, piecing together the twisted narrative Mark had constructed. It wasn't just about money or business. Mark had targeted him personally, dismantling his life piece by piece. And Sophia, she had been caught in the crossfire. The sound of a car door slamming outside jolted Jason from his thoughts. He moved to the window and peered out, his heart racing. A sleek, black car was parked across the street, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Jason recognized it immediately. It was Mark's. Jason's hands clenched into fists as he grabbed his cane and made his way to the door. Before he could open it, there was a loud knock. He hesitated, his mind racing. What was Mark doing here? Jason opened the door to find Mark standing there, his expression smug as always. "Evening, Jason," Mark said, his tone laced with mockery. "Mind if I come in?" Jason stepped aside reluctantly, his grip tightening on the cane. "You've got a lot of nerve showing up here." Mark sauntered into the living room, his eyes scanning the room before settling on the laptop. "I see you've been busy," he said, nodding toward the screen. "Find anything interesting?" Jason's voice was low and dangerous. "You planned the accident. You tried to ruin me." Mark chuckled, unbothered by the accusation. "Planned? That's a strong word. Let's just say I took advantage of an opportunity." Jason's blood boiled. "You destroyed my life, my marriage, everything I worked for. Why?" Mark leaned back against the couch, his expression unreadable. "Because I could. You were in my way, Jason, and frankly, you made it too easy." Jason's grip on his cane tightened as he took a step forward. "You think you can get away with this?" Mark's smirk widened. "Oh, Jason, I've already gotten away with it, and there's nothing you can do to stop me." Jason's heart pounded as he struggled to contain his anger. "You're wrong. I'll find a way to expose you. I'll make sure everyone knows who you really are." Mark's gaze hardened, his smirk fading. "Be careful, Jason. You've already lost so much. Don't make it worse for yourself." Jason took another step forward, his voice trembling with fury. "You don't scare me." Mark's lips curled into a cold smile. "We'll see." With that, Mark turned and left, the sound of the door slamming behind him echoing through the house. Jason stood frozen, his mind racing. He knew now, more than ever, that he couldn't let Mark win. He had to fight back, with everything he had. Jason sat at the edge of his bed, his head in his hands. The dim morning light crept through the blinds, illuminating the chaos of papers strewn across the room, legal documents, court notices, and a custody petition filed by Sophia's attorney. It felt surreal, as though the woman he had once loved was now an unrecognizable adversary. The sound of Lila's laughter echoed faintly from the living room. Jason's chest tightened. She didn't know, not yet. How could he tell her? How could he explain that her world was about to be torn apart? A knock at the bedroom door startled him. It was his mother, Helen, her face etched with worry. "Jason, you have to eat something," she said gently, holding out a plate of toast and eggs. He shook his head. "I can't, Mom. Not now." Helen sighed, sitting beside him. "You're no good to her if you don't take care of yourself. Lila needs you strong." Jason looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and weary. "She's trying to take her away from me. How do I fight that? How do I prove I'm the better parent when I'm broken?" Helen placed a hand on his knee, her voice firm. "You're not broken, Jason. You're her father. That's all that matters. Fight for her." Jason nodded slowly, the weight of his mother's words sinking in. "You're right. I can't let Sophia and Mark win." Later that afternoon, Jason stood in the courtroom, his heart pounding as the judge entered. The room was cold and sterile, yet the tension was palpable. Sophia sat across from him, her eyes avoiding his. She looked worn, a shadow of the woman he had once known, but Jason couldn't let sympathy cloud his resolve. The proceedings began, each side presenting their arguments. Sophia's attorney painted her as the stable, reliable parent, while subtly hinting at Jason's physical limitations and his financial struggles. Jason's attorney, a sharp and empathetic woman named Rachel, countered with evidence of Sophia's association with Mark and the questionable financial dealings he had uncovered. Rachel's voice was steady and confident, yet each revelation seemed to chip away at Jason's composure. When it was Jason's turn to testify, he stood slowly, leaning on his cane for support. He glanced at Lila, seated with Helen at the back of the courtroom, her wide eyes filled with fear and confusion. His heart ached as he began to speak. "Your Honor," he said, his voice trembling, "I may not have the perfect life or the resources Sophia has, but I have one thing she doesn't: unconditional love for my daughter. Lila is my world. She's what keeps me going, even when everything else falls apart." He paused, his throat tightening. "I know I'm not perfect. I've made mistakes, but I've always put her first. I've been there for her every step of the way, and I will continue to be there no matter what." Tears welled in Lila's eyes as she watched her father, her small hands clutching Helen's arm. Jason saw her lips move, mouthing the words, "I love you, Dad." As Jason returned to his seat, he caught Sophia's gaze for the briefest moment. Her eyes were filled with something he couldn't quite decipher: guilt, regret, or perhaps fear. The courtroom fell silent as the judge began to speak, her tone measured but firm. "This is not an easy decision, and I understand the gravity of its impact on both parties. My priority is the well-being of the child, and in cases like this, stability and consistency are paramount." Jason's heart pounded as he waited for the verdict, his hands gripping the edge of the table. He felt Helen's reassuring touch on his shoulder, but it did little to calm the storm inside him. After reviewing the evidence and testimonies, the judge continued, "I am granting joint custody. Lila will split her time between both parents, ensuring she maintains a strong relationship with each." A mixture of relief and disappointment washed over Jason. It wasn't the victory he had hoped for, but it wasn't a loss either. He turned to look at Lila, who smiled faintly, her eyes glistening with tears. It was enough, for now. As the courtroom emptied, Jason approached Sophia. "Why did you do this?" he asked softly, his voice tinged with pain. Sophia hesitated, her lips trembling. "I thought I was doing the right thing, but now I don't know." Jason stared at her, searching for a trace of the woman he once loved. "You need to figure it out, Sophia, because if you don't, you're going to lose her for good." She nodded, her tears falling freely. Jason turned and walked away, his cane tapping against the marble floor. He had won a small battle, but the war was far from over. Jason sat at his desk, staring at the mountain of evidence he had gathered. The emails, financial records, and testimonials all pointed to Mark's web of corruption and deceit. But this wasn't just about exposing Mark. It was about reclaiming his dignity, protecting his daughter, and ensuring that justice was served. He dialed Detective Harris's number with trembling fingers. "Harris, it's Jason. I've got everything you need to take him down." There was a pause on the other end before Harris replied, his tone cautious but resolute. "Meet me at the station in an hour. Bring everything." Jason hung up and packed the documents into a worn leather briefcase. His heart pounded as he thought about what lay ahead. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about closure. An hour later, Jason sat across from Harris in a small interrogation room at the station. The detective flipped through the files, his face growing darker with each passing page. "This is damning," Harris muttered. "If half of this checks out, Mark's finished." Jason leaned forward, his voice laced with urgency. "It all checks out, and there's more. He orchestrated my accident. He's the reason I lost everything." Harris's gaze softened. "I'll need to dig deeper, but with this, we can issue a warrant." Jason nodded, his resolve hardening. "Do it." The next morning, Jason found himself outside Mark's office building, watching as police cars pulled up. The sight of Mark being escorted out in handcuffs was both satisfying and surreal. Jason couldn't help but smirk as Mark's smug composure crumbled in the face of flashing cameras and shouting reporters. "Jason!" a voice called from behind him. He turned to see Sophia standing there, her expression conflicted. "Is it true? Is he going to prison?" Jason nodded, his tone clipped. "It's over for him." Sophia's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't know, Jason. I swear I didn't know how deep it went." Jason's jaw tightened. "You didn't want to know. You chose to look the other way, and now we're all paying the price." Sophia reached out, but Jason stepped back. "I'm doing this for Lila, not for you." She nodded, her tears falling silently as she whispered, "Thank you." Later that evening, Jason sat with Lila on the living room floor, playing a board game under the soft glow of the lamp. Her laughter filled the room, a sound he hadn't heard in far too long. For the first time in months, he felt a glimmer of peace. But the calm was short-lived. His phone buzzed with a notification, a news alert about Mark. Jason's eyes widened as he read the headline, "Business mogul Mark Jensen released on bail, vows to fight charges." His heart sank. He knew Mark wouldn't go down without a fight. The air was crisp as Jason stood by the lake, the soft ripple of water breaking the early morning stillness. He closed his eyes, letting the cool breeze wash over him. For the first time in months, he felt a faint sense of calm, a momentary reprieve from the chaos that had consumed his life. Behind him, Lila's laughter echoed, bright and unrestrained. She was chasing a small kite as it dipped and soared in the wind. Jason turned to watch her, his heart swelling with a bittersweet ache. Every smile she gave him reminded him of what he was fighting for. "Dad, look, it's flying so high!" Lila called out, her voice filled with delight. Jason smiled. "That's because you're strong enough to keep it up there." She giggled, her dark curls bouncing as she ran. For a moment, Jason allowed himself to believe that things could get better, that they were already getting better. Later, as they packed up their picnic, Helen joined Jason on the blanket, handing him a steaming cup of coffee. "She's resilient," Helen said, watching Lila with a soft smile. "She gets that from you." Jason shook his head. "She's been through so much. Sometimes I wonder if I'm enough for her." "You're more than enough," Helen replied firmly. "You've given her love, stability, and the courage to face whatever comes next. That's what matters." Jason's throat tightened as he nodded. "I just want her to be happy." As they packed up and headed home, Jason's phone buzzed. It was a text from Rachel, his attorney. "Mark's trial date is set. The DA wants you to testify." Jason's hands clenched around the phone. Testifying meant reliving everything, every betrayal, every lie. But he knew it was necessary. He couldn't let Mark walk free, not after everything he had done. That evening, as Jason tucked Lila into bed, she looked up at him with wide, trusting eyes. "Dad, are we going to be okay?" Jason knelt beside her, brushing a curl from her forehead. "Yes, sweetheart. We're going to be okay. I promise." Her small hand reached out to hold his, and she whispered, "I believe you." After she fell asleep, Jason sat alone in the dimly lit living room, staring at the flickering fire. His mind replayed the events of the past months, the lies, the betrayal, the pain. But there were moments of light, too. Lila's laughter, Helen's unwavering support, Rachel's determination. As the fire crackled, Jason reached for a notebook and began to write. He poured his thoughts onto the page, each word a step toward healing. He wrote about his fears, his anger, and his hope for a better future. It was messy, raw, and unpolished, but it was his truth. The next day, Jason met Rachel at the courthouse to prepare for the trial. She greeted him with a warm smile and a firm handshake. "We've got this," she said, her confidence bolstering his own. Inside, Jason faced Sophia for the first time since the custody hearing. She looked away, her expression guarded. But when their eyes met briefly, there was a flicker of something, regret perhaps, or an unspoken apology. As they went over the testimony, Jason felt a sense of resolve settling over him. This wasn't just about Mark or Sophia anymore. It was about standing up for himself, for Lila, and for the life they deserved. That night, Jason found himself back at the lake, the stars reflecting in the still water. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, letting the serenity of the moment seep into his soul. Healing wouldn't come overnight. It wouldn't erase the scars or the memories, but it was a start. And for Jason, that was enough. Sophia sat alone in her car, the weight of the last few months pressing heavily on her chest. She stared at the courthouse steps, her heart pounding as guilt and shame battled within her. Today, she would face Jason, not as an adversary but as a woman determined to make amends for the pain she had caused. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from Mark. "Don't show up. I'll handle this." She deleted it without hesitation. Mark's control over her life had ended the moment she realized the depths of his manipulation. She had been a pawn in his game, but no longer. Taking a deep breath, she stepped out of the car and walked toward the courthouse. Inside, Jason was already seated at the table with Rachel, his expression guarded. Their eyes met briefly, and she saw the hurt and anger that still lingered. It was deserved, but it didn't make it any easier to bear. When the judge called a recess, Sophia approached Jason hesitantly. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jason studied her for a moment before nodding. They moved to a quiet corner of the hallway, the tension between them palpable. "I need to say this," Sophia began, her voice trembling. "I was wrong, about everything. I let Mark manipulate me, and in doing so I hurt you and Lila more than I can ever undo. I'm so sorry, Jason." Jason crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. "Sorry doesn't fix what you've done, Sophia. You put our daughter through hell." Tears welled in Sophia's eyes as she nodded. "I know, and I don't expect forgiveness, but I need you to know. I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make this right." Jason sighed, the weight of her words sinking in. "You can start by telling the truth in there," he said, nodding toward the courtroom. "I will," Sophia promised. "Mark lied to me, Jason, about everything. I thought I was protecting Lila, but I was just protecting him, and I can't live with that anymore." Back in the courtroom, Sophia took the stand. Her hands shook as she recounted the lies, the coercion, and the threats that had kept her tied to Mark. She admitted her own complicity, sparing no detail in exposing the depth of Mark's deceit. Jason watched her closely, his emotions a whirlwind. For the first time in months, he saw a glimpse of the woman he had once loved, the woman who had been lost beneath layers of betrayal and regret. When the proceedings ended for the day, Sophia approached Jason again. "Thank you for listening," she said quietly. "I know I don't deserve it, but I hope one day you'll see that I'm trying." Jason nodded, his voice softer this time. "For Lila's sake, I hope you mean that." As Sophia walked away, a sense of relief washed over her. It was only the beginning, but it was a step toward redemption, a step toward becoming the mother Lila deserved. Later that evening, Jason sat with Helen in the kitchen, recounting the day's events. "She was honest," he said, his tone thoughtful. "For the first time in a long time, I think she actually meant it." Helen sipped her tea, her eyes kind but cautious. "People can change, Jason, but it's actions, not words, that matter." He nodded, the truth of her words resonating. Sophia's journey to redemption was far from over, but perhaps, for Lila's sake, there was hope. As Jason tucked Lila into bed that night, she looked up at him with her innocent, curious eyes. "Is Mommy going to be okay?" she asked. Jason's throat tightened. "I think she will be, sweetheart. She's trying." Lila smiled, a small but hopeful smile that melted Jason's heart. "I'm glad," she said softly. I just want us all to be happy. Jason kissed her forehead, his resolve strengthening. Me too, kiddo, me too. The soft hum of the morning sunlight bathed the living room as Jason sat on the couch, sipping his coffee. Across from him, Lila was perched on the carpet, carefully sketching on a piece of paper. Her small face was scrunched in concentration, her tongue poking out just slightly, a quirk she'd had since she was little. What are you drawing, sweetheart? Jason asked, setting his mug down and leaning forward. Lila looked up, her eyes shining. It's us. You, me, Nana Helen, and even Mommy. See? She held up the drawing. 4 stick figures stood beneath a large golden sun, their hands clasped together. Jason's chest tightened. That's beautiful, Lila. You've got quite the talent. She smiled, but then her face turned serious. Daddy, do you think we'll ever all be together again? The question hit Jason like a punch to the gut. He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. I don't know, sweetie. But what I do know is that we're all trying to do what's best for you. That's what matters most. Lila nodded slowly, her gaze dropping back to her drawing. I just want everyone to be happy. Jason reached out and gently squeezed her shoulder. You're the bravest girl I know, Lila, and no matter what, I'll always be here for you. Later that day, Jason and Lila visited the local park, one of her favorite spots. She raced to the swings, her laughter ringing out as Jason pushed her higher and higher. Nearby, Helen watched with a smile, her heart warmed by the sight of their bond. Higher, Daddy! Higher! Lila squealed, her joy contagious. As Jason pushed her, he couldn't help but marvel at her resilience. Despite everything she had been through, the court battles, the uncertainty, Lila had remained a beacon of light in his darkest days. When they returned home, an envelope was waiting on the kitchen counter. It was from Sophia. Jason opened it cautiously, finding a handwritten letter inside. He read it silently, his eyes scanning the familiar curves of Sophia's handwriting. Dear Jason, I've been thinking a lot about everything, about us, about Lila, about the mistakes I've made. I know words can't undo the hurt I've caused, but I want you to know that I'm working on being better, for Lila and for myself. I hope you'll let me show her that people can change. I hope she'll see that even when things are broken, they can be rebuilt. Thank you for taking care of her when I couldn't. You've always been her rock, and for that, I'll always be grateful. Sophia. Jason folded the letter and set it down, his mind swirling. He wasn't ready to trust Sophia completely, but her words carried a sincerity he hadn't seen in years. Daddy, is that from Mommy? Lila asked, peeking around the corner. Jason nodded, crouching down to meet her gaze. It is. She says she's trying to be better. She loves you very much. Lila tilted her head, her eyes thoughtful. Do you think she means it? Jason smiled softly. I think she's trying, and that's a good start. That evening, as Jason tucked Lila into bed, she clung to him a little longer than usual. Daddy, she whispered, her voice trembling. Even if Mommy doesn't come back, we'll be okay, right? Jason's heart ached at her vulnerability. He kissed her forehead, his voice firm but gentle. We'll always be okay, Lila, because we have each other. As she drifted off to sleep, Jason sat by her bedside watching the steady rise and fall of her chest. Lila's strength was a reminder of his own, a testament to the love that had carried them through the storm. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Jason's kitchen, casting a golden glow over the breakfast table. Lila sat at her usual spot, nibbling on a slice of toast smeared with strawberry jam. Across from her, Jason stirred his coffee, watching her with a quiet smile. It had been weeks since the custody battle ended. The house was quieter now, but the air felt lighter, less burdened by secrets and lies. Jason had taken small steps toward rebuilding, but the road ahead still felt uncertain. Daddy, Lila said, breaking the silence, can we go to the lake today like we used to? Jason blinked, surprised. The lake held so many memories, some joyful, others tinged with pain, but Lila's hopeful expression made it impossible to say no. Of course, sweetheart, let's pack a lunch. By late morning, they were sitting by the water, a gentle breeze rustling the trees. Lila ran along the shore, her laughter echoing across the calm expanse. Jason watched her, his heart swelling with pride and gratitude. As he unpacked their lunch, a familiar voice called out, Jason? Lila? He turned to see Sophia standing a few feet away, her hands clasped nervously. She looked different, calmer, more at peace. Jason's chest tightened. He hadn't expected to see her here. Mommy! Lila ran to her, throwing her arms around Sophia's waist. Sophia knelt, hugging Lila tightly. Hi, sweetheart. I didn't know you'd be here today. Jason rose slowly, his eyes meeting Sophia's. What are you doing here? I've been coming here to think, Sophia admitted, her voice soft. This place reminds me of better times. Jason nodded, unsure of what to say. Lila tugged on Sophia's hand. Mommy, come sit with us. Sophia hesitated, glancing at Jason for permission. He gestured to the blanket. Join us. They sat together, the tension palpable at first. But as Lila chattered on about school and her latest drawings, the barriers between Jason and Sophia began to dissolve, if only slightly. I've started seeing a counselor, Sophia said quietly, once Lila ran off to chase butterflies. I'm trying to understand myself better, to be better, for her. Jason studied her, searching for any hint of insincerity. Instead, he saw a woman genuinely trying to change. That's good, he said finally. It's a start? Sophia nodded, tears welling in her eyes. Thank you for letting me be here. The afternoon passed peacefully, the three of them finding a tentative rhythm. For the first time in a long time, it felt like they were on the same page, united, if only for Lila's sake. That evening, Jason sat by the fireplace, a notebook open on his lap. He scribbled down his thoughts, the words flowing easily. It wasn't just a record of the past, but a promise to himself, to keep moving forward no matter how uncertain the path. Helen entered the room, carrying 2 mugs of tea. You look deep in thought, she said, handing him a cup. I was just thinking about today, Jason replied. About how far we've come. Helen smiled, her eyes warm. You've done well, Jason. Lila's happy and you're finding your way. That's all that matters. Jason took a sip of tea, his heart full. I couldn't have done it without you. Without all of you. As the fire crackled, Jason felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in months. The future was still unwritten, but for the first time he wasn't afraid of it. With Lila by his side and the support of those who cared for him, he knew they would be okay.